Our next speaker was one of my students and later became my boss when he was principal at Winters High School. And this is George Griffin. He'll be talking about the Griffin family.
Well, thanks for coming, and I'll try not to bore you with too much direct genealogy. In terms of the direct Griffin line, it pretty much came from Virginia. Spelling was creative, I think, particularly with last names, as you're searching through documents. The first direct descendant that I found born in Virginia was John Giffen, as it's shown in the records in Virginia, Giffen. His son, however, ended up being George Griffin. But John was born in 1745 in Virginia and married another Virginian, J.A. Campbell. They got married in the 1760s. They had a son, George, who is known as Pat. I don't know why. I haven't found any record of that. But anyway, he was born in 1771 in Frederick County, Virginia, and married a Nancy Johnston Griffin, who was also born in that same county in 1778. Speaking of George Washington connections, I found one record that referred to that George Griffin having some connections with Mr. Washington, particularly in the surveying business. I also found that Nancy Johnston Griffin, her mother's family was somehow directly connected to Mr. Washington. And her mother's maiden name was Kyle. And her mother received from Mr. Washington's estate a bequest of, well, more than $300 because she had died by the time George Washington did, so it went to her children. So Nancy Johnston Griffin received a bequest, according to the archives of the state of Virginia and the disposition of estates, of $300. So how exactly they were related, I have no idea, but he left her a few bucks, so that was nice of him. Anyway, George and Nancy had Joseph Griffin. He was one of several children that they had. And he was born in Virginia, Frederick County, in 1818. His mother died when he was 12 years old. And I was told that by my family all along, that his mom had died when he was young, and he had gone to live with a sister and her husband, an older sister. And I was kind of wondering, well, what happened to the dad? Well, I still don't know, other than it seems that he lived for another 40 years. So why he pawned his son off to a sister, I don't know. Maybe he didn't want a 12-year-old boy around the house when he was trying to find a new wife. I don't know. But nonetheless, my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Griffin, went to live with his sister and brother-in-law, and that's where he learned the carpentry trade. In those days, I think teachers were probably even more poorly paid, perhaps, than in later years, because he was actually a school teacher who was a carpenter as well, so that I guess he could support his family. Joseph learned the carpentry trade from him, and at some point in his late teens decided to follow many folks westward in search of land and fame and fortune and whatever. And I had never really heard, that's another thing, my family, I was really lucky because my dad grew up not only with his parents but his grandparents in the home, and there was this really strong oral tradition of telling stories. But as I've done additional research since, I'm finding all kinds of stuff that was never passed, not because it was necessarily good, bad, or indifferent, but I guess it just wasn't important to be retold. I had always thought that Joseph, being a 12-year-old, getting shuffled off to the sister and then whatever, left by himself. Well, no, he had a brother David that went to Missouri with him as well. Joseph went a somewhat circuitous route to Missouri, going through Kentucky, then Ohio. But it doesn't appear from what records I can find that he spent very long in either of those places, and ended up in northeastern Missouri in Rawls County, which is where he met and married Nancy Ely. Hence the connection in our families. If there was one before, which is likely, because I think both families came from Virginia, ended up in Missouri, and whatever, but nonetheless they married each other in Missouri. And I believe that, and I can tell you that they married in 1844. Now, if you're doing math, she was born in 1828. She was 16, he was 26. But if you're familiar with the prairie, of the mid-1800s, that was fairly common. Men would go and make enough money that they could have a family, and the girls by 16, it's time to go be a mom and a wife and a whatever. So those age differences were actually very, very common in the middle of the country at that time. They married, and they eventually had 12 children together, although only 7 of them lived what you would call full lives. 4 died in childhood, and 1 died at the age of 23, and I'll get to that. So Joseph was in Missouri, doing fine, making money, farming. He put together enough stake that he had apparently a fairly good-sized farming operation with all of the accompaniment of the South at that time. And anyway, but he and his brother-in-law, Ben, got the itch in 1850 and came to California to make their fortune in the gold fields. That didn't work out. And they were back in a year in Missouri with their families. But apparently they were quite impressed with the opportunities in agriculture they'd seen when they were here. So in 1857, I don't want to step on Nancy's story. Joseph sold all of his holdings in Missouri, packed up his family, and off they went to California. Now keep in mind that when he left, he had 5 children between the age of infant and 12-year-old, in a wagon or 2, with oxen and whatever else, and his wife, who'd had 5 children in 10 years, and out they came to California. Now Joseph and Nancy, even though they came across with the Ely family, initially settled up near Knight's Landing. And I don't know the exact location, but it was south and east, so probably maybe a quarter of the way between Knight's Landing and current Woodland. And he was there. They were there for 10 years, where they continued to have children, and he commenced in the farming of that time. And if Tom loaned me a great book after the gold rush that talks significantly about the agriculture and just the life in this region after the gold rush. If you haven't read it, and the author came and presented as a part of the series. Yes. I really recommend the book. Now, I don't recommend that you read it word for word, because it can be cumbersome with lots of detail that isn't necessarily something you want to commit to memory. But to get a sense of the life that people were living in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s in this region, it's incredible. Even with all of what my family had talked about with me, I had no concept of the constant either drought or flood, or drought and flood, or whatever that wiped out people just left and right every 5 years, and the constant churning of population that caused. Very few families stuck for very long, mostly because oftentimes through no fault of their own, they went broke. You know, if you were too close to the creek and it flooded and it killed all your livestock and that was all of your capital, you were done. And another thing that was commented about in that book is, and there was no banking system particularly, but you could borrow money, and it might cost you anywhere from 10 to 20% a month in interest. It was insane how anybody survived it. Anyway, back to the thing. So, my family had been pretty involved in swine production in Missouri, and when they first came out here, they did a lot of that, plus the mule business was very lucrative at the time because it was, the primary draft animal for getting cargo and people and everything else any place. So he made money from swine and from selling mules and then from dry farming, because that's pretty much what you did here. There were no irrigation systems. This really was the grain basket. And if you read some Civil War information, tons of the grain that fed, particularly the Union, came from California. So, raised grain, whether it was barley or wheat or whatever they could get to grow, and they had that pattern of dividing their land into thirds. So this is fallow this year, and this is producing grain this year, and this is being fed off this year, and it just constantly rotated, and that's how they survived. Anyway, so he was in Knights Landing for 10 years, and in 1867 they had the opportunity, and I'm guessing that it's probably because his wife wanted to be closer to her brother, to buy the ranch where my family currently lives now. There at Buckeye. So they bought that ranch. I found a deed recording in the archives, I don't know, 25 years ago or so when I was looking at it, and it showed where he had paid Mr. Logenauer, and I want to say it was $1,500 in gold coin for 400 acres more or less. That's what it says. Now my family had always told me that we bought the ranch from somebody named Wolf. I'm guessing, and if you know anything about it, if you look at old maps of Yolo County and who was involved in the quasi-banking industry, Mr. Logenauer was quite a good businessman and he had capital. So I'm guessing that he loaned Mr. Wolf money, and that's why my great-great-grandfather ended up paying Mr. Logenauer for the ranch. So he bought the ranch there, and 10 years later, constructed this home for his family. He built it himself. You'll recall that I mentioned he was apprenticed as a carpenter as a boy, so he had carpentry skills. The way they did it was, through mail order or something, they looked, I don't know where the catalog came from, but they picked a set of plans.
Sears.
Could have very well been Sears and Roebuck, although I'm not sure 1877 that they were around, but could have been, because he started selling watches not too long before that and got himself in business. But they bought a set of plans, and the set of plans came with your cut sheet of the materials to order from the mill. So he bought his plans, and Mr. Ish, who's a descendant of the Wolfskills, later told me that the house that burned out on the Wolfskill Ranch in the early 70s was the exact same house with minor modifications made by the actual construction crew, because one or the other had seen somebody else's house and liked it and bought the same plans. Anyway, started building the house by ordering the plans, and they ordered the lumber from a mill up in Marysville. Had all the lumber milled to the specifications, and at that time, redwood was plentiful, easy to work, strong, because it was old growth redwood, and cheap, relatively speaking. So all of downstairs it's 14 feet, and upstairs it's 12 feet, and all of the studs run from the floor joist in the bottom to the ceiling in the top, and it's solid, clear, full cut, 2x4 redwood on 16-inch centers. Got the house stuff there, built it. Must have been quite a challenge, because keep in mind, this is 1877. He was born in 1818. So he's 60 years old. And 60 years old in the 1800s was old. Or very close to 60 years old. Anyway, they got the house built. Must have been not much of a great house that was there before. I don't really know. I do know that when my dad was doing a history of the building of the house, there was a story that was recounted to him that one night, they had to feed the crew, and so they made a big pot of beans, and oh God, what are we going to serve the beans in? And finally somebody come out with a thunder mug. Anybody know what a thunder mug is? A commode from under the bed, which they thoroughly cleaned and used as a tureen to serve the beans, much to the amusement of all who participated. Anyway, he lived only another 8 years. He died in 1885, so he only got to enjoy his house for a few years. But anyway, staying behind were, of course, a number of his children. Now, the thing that I love to think about in history is what must it have been like then? And we've talked a little bit about that. Well, my great-grandfather, John, who I'll talk about in a minute, was the first of the children born in California. He was born in 1859 when they were still living up near Knights Landing. And he told my father lots of stories of his childhood, and that's really why I feel blessed, because my father, having grown up in the home not only with his parents but his grandparents, had a daily interaction with a generation that was truly the settling group. Anyway, one day apparently his parents had loaded up the wagon. They were going to go to Woodland to get their month's worth of supplies or 6 months worth of supplies or whatever, because imagine the roads and on a wagon and going 8-10 miles to Woodland to get whatever you need. So they left him, 3 or 4-year-old boy, with the neighbor, because it was going to be an all-day arduous trip, whatever. And off they went. Well, oh my God, it was like the biggest scary event in the family of the year, because after they got about a half mile down the road, he broke loose from the neighbor and started chasing the wagon. Big deal. Well, the big deal was one of his cousins had been mauled by a grizzly not very far from that area, and they were just sure that the little boy was going to get eaten. Can you imagine living here and worrying about grizzly bears? Anyway, so the family, the children that they had, as I said, 5 were born in Virginia and came out together. Once they arrived here, I got to change pages again. They had some more. The oldest was Thomas David, or TD. He settled in Colusa County, owned a ranch near Williams, and lived there until 1933 at his death. So he lived to be 88 years old. George William, and I guess I should start clicking some pictures here, huh? Because we're going to start to get that. So that's Joseph and Nancy. There's the Buckeye district that they came to. And keep in mind, as was mentioned earlier, there wasn't anything else before the railroad. So Buckeye was the whole southwest corner of the county. To give you a sense, this is a modern map that has superimposed the Wolfskill land grant, and Buckeye is up here. There's a 1900 map that outlines the Buckeye district, which was basically a school district at that time, and because it still had its one-room school that we'll talk about a little bit later. But you can see that here's the Ely group, and this is where we are, and I'll talk more about why it says my great-grandmother's name instead of something else in a minute. And now you can see what it looks like, a little different. And not very many of those names are still there. So here's the crew right after they, or shortly after, they packed up and moved everything to Winters from Buckeye. As it was mentioned earlier, when the railroad came through, my great uncle, whatever Benjamin Ely would be to me, didn't really want a railroad running through the middle of his ranch, and Mr. Winters was much more interested in it. So the route came through here instead of further east. And they basically, as soon as that bridge was built and the tracks came through, the whole town of Buckeye was picked up and moved to town. And this is one of the buildings that was moved to town, and it was the Baptist church that was started in 1861 in Buckeye, and it was moved to Winters, and it served apparently until 1883, according to that. This is circa 1877. I don't know who those people are.
Don't remember.
Yeah, I've forgotten their names. So there's the house, probably in the 1890s, I'm guessing. And there's a house in the probably 30s. Same, just different view. Note that this is the windmill, and this is the tank house. The tank house was one of the most important buildings on the ranch. Because not only is it the place where you stored enough water so that if the wind didn't blow, you had some, but in our particular case, when they originally built the house, they put a root cellar in. The water table's so high out there that it flooded every winter and they lost their food. So they did away with the root cellar thing fairly early on. But when they built the tank house, the bottom floor they built with walls a foot thick. And they saved all the redwood shavings from cutting all the lumber and filled that foot of wall with redwood shavings, sawdust. It's also set slightly below grade. You step up over a threshold, but if you notice, once you're in, you're probably a couple, 3 inches below actual. It's a tremendous insulator cooler. And the door's on the north side, and there's lattice that you can't see. There's a porch roof over the first floor that gives you about 4 feet of space, and then lattice outside of it so the sun never directly hits the walls. And that was their refrigeration unit for the first 50 years that they lived there. Anyway, so Nancy, this is where I wanted to get to. Nancy Ely Griffin and her sons. And please, to the ladies in the room, I'm not meaning to be sexist, I just have no clue who that is. So, it's either one of their wives or one of the 2 daughters that that lived to adulthood, and I'm not certain. But Nancy and Joseph's sons, John, who's my great-grandfather, James B., who bought a ranch with my great-grandfather, and then they split it, and it now belongs to Button Turkovich, and it's on Road 89 here just north of town. It was the old Joe Griffin place, they called it, because his son ended up being named Joe. And so it's just north of town, between where Mark Mariani and Dennis Mariani Sr. live, if you know where that is, same side of the road between there. So that ranch. Then T.D., or Thomas, who is the Colusa County, the Williams Fellow. George W., who farmed some and was sheriff of Yolo County for a number of years in the first part of the 20th century. And then Joseph A., who's Joe Boggs. Where Boggs came from, I have no idea, but that's how he was known. I think probably distinguished him from his father. And he was the youngest of the boys, and he is the founder of the Buckhorn Bar. That's what they all did. Oh, by the way, George W. is George William. That is also my name. And again, a funny thing about how families work. My dad and I went into the sheriff's office when it was on Court Street. Oh, I was probably 16 or 17 years old. And they had pictures of all the old sheriffs up there. And I went, George William Griffin. Oh, that's Uncle Will. Yeah. Well, he didn't even know his first name was George. He remembered him. Of course, he died when my dad was, I don't know, 5 years old or something. 5 or 6. Let's see, when did George die? Yeah, my dad was 6 years old when he died. But he always had known him as Uncle Will. And I said, well, you didn't name, no. And I always knew that I wasn't named after him because I was named after my grandfather. And Bill's uncle was the giver of my middle name. So anyway, no connection in the name other than it's the same. So here they are, John and his wife, Alice Martin Griffin. And this is a really cool story. So, John was the firstborn in California, but like the fourth son. So he was the younger one, but everybody else had gone out to make their way. And in fact, by the time that his father passed away, he and his brother had bought the Levi Morris tract, which is what I was talking about north of town here. So he already owned 300 acres. But he still helped his dad, and when his dad died, he took over helping to keep running the ranch for his mother. He had not yet married. A relative from Missouri came out to visit and had a picture of some gal that he apparently thought was pretty attractive. And he said to that relative, I'm going to go back there and I'm going to marry her. And he did. Wow. And the irony is that I think the reason the guy had a picture of her was because her family was living in the house that his parents had sold them 25 years earlier. So she was actually born in the same house as some of his brothers and sisters, 2,000 miles apart. Anyway, he goes back there, courts her, marries her. It only took him 6 months. He must have been a factory worker. And then 3 years later, after they married, they had my grandfather, George Martin Griffin. And this is a picture of them in front of the house with Nancy and other people saying so, and then a cook in the back. Now the life thing again, and I'm talking too long. I'll speed up. We good? Have I bored you yet?
No, you're good.
The Chinese influence in Northern California. There were tons of domestic workers that were Chinese. Including they had Chinese cooks at the ranch. Probably for 25 or 30 years, near as I can tell. All through my grandfather growing up years of the 1890s. Before that, and then after as well, for some time. And so you're going to see a couple of pictures of some fellows that were in that capacity. And one of the things that made me realize it, I didn't even know it until one time, my father made a comment about how good his father was with chopsticks. Okay, white Protestant winters, 1890, how the heck? Well, Dad told me the story. They used to go every year. Their vacation was in October. They'd go to San Francisco to go to the beach. Go figure, but that was where there was one. And then they'd go to dinner, and they often go to Chinese restaurants because my grandfather loved Chinese food. And it would always amaze the people waiting on them, the facility with which my grandfather used chopsticks. He learned to use them before he learned knives and forks, because being a person who liked to eat like me, he hung out in the kitchen with the cooks all the time and learned to use chopsticks in Winters or in Buckeye in the 1890s before he learned to use a knife and fork. Anyway, so John stayed, took care of the ranch for his mother, and one of the things that his father, Joseph, had said to his mother as he was in his later years is, after I'm gone, please do not, what they called at that time, I guess, go security, which means secure any loans, for any of the kids after I'm gone. The ranch will take care of you, but you can't afford that risk. She did not heed his advice, and in the difficulties of the 1890s, she almost lost the ranch. And as a result of my great-grandfather's intervention and working with the bank, he was able to take the debt and restructure it and take the ranch, and she, of course, stayed there. But that's how he ended up holding the ranch, is because he paid off the debts of some of his siblings and others that his mother had secured. In terms of the 1890s at the ranch, you'll recall that one of the famous events in Winters was about, what, 1891 or 2? 1892. That's a famous event at the house as well. Because when they originally built the house, they had marble mantles on all the fireplaces. Freestanding, full marble mantles. That all fell down and broke in that earthquake, with some other minor structural damage and a couple of broken windows. So they had to replace all the mantles, a couple of windows, and then go in, and some of the hips in the roof had to be shored up and repaired. Because you can imagine a building that tall, built on brick pillars, had some sway to it when the ground starts doing this. Here's a family reunion sometime. This is my grandfather. So given that he was born in 1890, I'm guessing that's probably 1902 or 3. If you're really good with faces, you'll note that that was a bunch of the brothers. The sisters are in there too, and Grandma is in the middle. And I believe that's Mrs. Ely. I'm not certain of that, but I believe that is. And anyway, so talk about the Southern hospitality thing. The family got together frequently, and that continued to occur up through my father's youth in the 1930s and 40s. Apparently, they decided to have the men sit for a portrait once. I thought that was kind of interesting, because if you know about the expense of portraiture back in the turn of the century time, that wasn't real common, but they did. So Jonathan and Alice Martin, I've already talked a little bit about how they met and married. And here's how they formed. And you saw some of this earlier with Nikki's stuff. Now, as I mentioned, when they first got here, it was all dry farming. They ran livestock initially, more swine, then they got pretty much into sheep. And so probably by 1900, it was sheep and grain and pasture land. So I just got a number of pictures to give you a sense of how the technology progressed. This is a threshing machine. This looks more like a Rode Goldboard something or another. And I can't find it, but I have a plate of it. This is actually probably up at Ben Ely's place, because I found a plate online that was for sale that I couldn't buy, but I was able to make a copy of it, and now I can't find it. Of a contraption that ran by a combination of steam engine and mules, where they threshed and separated the wheat from the shaft to make it go a little faster. Early harvester with all the mules. Same kind of thing. And this says George Griffin Ranch, so I'm guessing that this was probably the sheriff, because he farmed as well. And now we're getting mechanized, by golly. Look at that tractor. And that was the evolution of my great-grandfather's farming experience. from the 1880s with basically no mechanization or maybe a steam engine, running a contraption that had 47 belts and probably people getting in the way all the time, to early tractors. I can't even imagine trying to...
Steam.
They thought they needed big wheels, I guess.
Yeah.
The steam engines there.
Yep.
Stay out of the mud.
So, the other part of the business. I mentioned the dry farming. This was the old sheep barn. It sat at the back of the ranch from the 1870s until it was taken down by Vern Bruin. We had to. The squirrels had so undermined it, and it hadn't been used for livestock since 1947. In the early 80s, my dad and my grandmother were so afraid that some of the workers around the ranch or somebody go in there and it'd fall down on them that we had it taken down. But that was the old sheep barn. This is the new shearing barn that was put in sometime in the 30s. That still sits at the back of the ranch. And then this is the hay barn that sat just in front of those a ways. And it was an 1880s barn that lasted until about 1990 when fire and hay got too close to each other. But there's what it looked like just outside the fence at the ranch in the 1930s. So there they are. I guess that they had to gather the sheep in close for some reason. I'm not certain, but I think that that one of those is my grandfather. There's the hay barn again. And there's my grandfather with his happy little dog. Must be in the 1920s. Now, my grandfather was born in 1890. Both he and my father had the distinction of being born in the house there. And both in the same room, I believe, the north front room, which is the upstairs bedroom on the north side, northwest corner of the house. He was kind of slow like me. He didn't get married until his late 30s. So, anyway, there they are with some livestock. And, oh, that's my great-grandfather looking respectable. Guess I should talk for a minute more about him. He was also very involved civically. He served on the Winters Union High School board for the better part of 35 years, from the early 1890s when it was first established up to about 1930, with the exception of the 4 years that he served as a supervisor for his district in Yolo County, which was 1896 to 1900. And this is a dedication from the 1923 Poppy, thanking him for his service. The exact same article and picture appears in the 1928 one, so they liked him twice, but didn't do any extra work to. Right here, in 1907 at Winters High School, that's before the W.H. Weeks building, and his classmates. There he is on the baseball team as well, about that same time. And there he is in class. So he did actually go to class. We have photographic evidence that at least one day he was in class. And you can tell by the hairline, he's got mine. He's right over there. And here he is after high school, having a good time, it looks like, with Johnny Sievers and I'm sure some fine upstanding young ladies. And then there he is in the band. And he was very musical. He played a number of different instruments, my father told me. Unfortunately, he died a year before I was born. But most importantly, his participation in the band, while probably being his diversion much of his late teens and early 20s, was also how he met my grandmother, because she played in the Dixon band. And so sometime about 1926 or 7, they met. They got married in 1927, and there he is with a saxophone. The rest, they say, is history. Of course, he had to take time out to try to look respectable now and again, sit with folks. And then here's some of the fellas just working on the ranch. I don't really recognize any of them, other than I think there might be a couple of the Asian fellows and then a few others. Can you imagine? Quite a work vehicle. and there's the local garage. Anyway, I'm just going to stop at that for a second. He engaged in the same business with his father. My family, for whatever, I guess all the men were pretty much slow starters with the possible exception of my father, because my great-grandfather was in his 30s before his first and only child was born. My grandfather was 37 when my father was born. And my dad, not quite so slow, but he was 32 when I was born. And I was 37 when my daughter was born. So we don't have as many generations as some families who've been here this period of time do. I guess the men are just slow. I don't know what to say.
They're particular.
Yeah, or something. Or hard to find anybody to put up with us. So my father attended this Buckeye schoolhouse. Now Buckeye School actually sat, I don't know if y'all know where Janet Johnston lives, but this sat on the corner right next to her house, essentially. And that, I remember this building. It was taken down in the late 60s. I was a pretty small boy, but I remember this building. The original school was actually diagonal, or kitty corner, northeast of it. And I don't know if they moved it because that corner always floods, because it does now, or why they moved it. But the field across from where I live, we always called it the schoolhouse field. That's how it was known to me, whatever. Even though the schoolhouse, in my recollection, was actually not in that field. It was across the way. And one of the stories that my grandfather told my dad as a boy is yeah, one of the best years was we got a whole month off of school one time because so-and-so or whatever did something in class he shouldn't have done. And the old school teacher, who was a man at that time, said, okay, you go out and you get your switch and you clean it up good for me because you're going to switch it. So the kid goes out to the wherever and he gets a switch, he cleans it all off, and the school teacher proceeds to apply it to him and scratch his own back and chew on it a little bit and whatever else. Well, it turns out that the kid had stripped off some nice poison oak. And the school teacher got poison oak in and out and every place in between, and was so sick that they actually had to suspend school for a month. But again, that was the building across the way. This is the building that my father attended. My father, as I said, was born in the house that I showed you earlier, and he was born there in 1928. Attended this school from 1934, must have been 33, no, 34, because there was no kindergarten at the time. 34 until he went to Winters High School and began in 1942. He was the class that got to spend, or a class, that got to spend a very brief time in the W.H. Weeks building, and then it burned, and spent the rest of high school in City Hall, in people's garages, at the gym, and any place else that they could assemble a few desks and a place to hold class, because the war was on, there was no building anything, and they just ran the school best they could wherever they could hold class. And there's my father in the original Buckhorn Bar. He, I'm guessing, is about 10 years old, so probably 1938, somewhere along in there. I'm sure that Joe Boggs is in that picture, but most of the other people, well, it's just not the highest quality photograph. Light was not exactly right. But anyway, this picture actually usually hangs in the Buckhorn someplace, and they got it from my family at some point. I was just really lucky to grow up with a dad who grew up with a grandfather who told him all about Buckeye. I would have known far less about what life was like back in those days had it not been for the fact that my dad got to hear about it directly from someone who lived it. I sometimes long for not the inconveniences that they had, but seeing what that land must have been like. He told my dad of herds of tule elk and antelope migrating through the back of the ranch at different times of the year. And just all of the amazing things that must have existed before we kind of reshaped everything. Anyway, I'm going to stop there because he was truly the last person that got to live that direct connection to the town when he was to the former town of Buckeye. When he was growing up, there were still a few families around that were from that period, so he knew all of those folks. Not to mention that because he lived in the home with his grandparents, all of his great aunts and uncles used to come and visit and tell the stories of the 1800s and when they were settling the area. So That's why I kind of decided to leave off here, because this is a Buckeye and not a Winter's History Project or Winter's Talk. So anyway, that's our connection to Buckeye. Yeah.
Wait, okay, so when your dad is telling you all these stories, were you like super interested in this stuff, or you like a lot of kids where it's like, no, I just didn't go out and do something else?
No, I was weird.
You liked it.
I always liked history. I always enjoyed, and it wasn't just my dad. It was my grandmother as well. And you know, my grandmother. When I went to, my grandmother could have been Victorian. Some of you knew her.
This is
Bessie.
Griffin.
Yeah. You know, it was really important to her to pass on the information as well. And when you went to visit Grandma, or when I went to visit Grandma, Grandma didn't have slews of kids around. Even though I had 3 or 4 sisters, it was rarely, unless it was a holiday, all of us there at once. If I was there, it was usually because I was there. And Grandma and I spent time together. Because she just wasn't the kind of person in her older years that wanted a bunch of little kids making her crazy. I guess, I don't know. So we spent a lot of time talking and telling stories. And we're in the house with all these artifacts. You know, like I showed you that Chinese gin jug, and I was going to bring it, and I said I'd probably break it. But, you know, my great-great-grandfather allowed no drinking whatsoever, and no card playing, and no anything. And as a matter of fact, my dad used to tell a story that his grandfather told him. They were in the middle of grain harvest. And imagine 1880s or 1870s. There's just not labor laying around everywhere, you know? And you need a hell of a crew to harvest, you know, 300 or 400 acres of grain with mules and a hand thresher and all the stuff. He went out to the bunkhouse, caught them playing cards, and told them, pack your stuff, you're leaving now. Because that is the devil's play, and I will not have that on my ranch. The cooks used to get gin, for lack of a better term, in these ceramic bottles that are kind of shaped like a bulbous thing with almost looks like a trumpet mouthpiece on the top. And they weren't supposed to be drinking. So they drank this stuff, and you know, there was a small Chinese community, I assume that's where they must have bought it or whatever, and this is 1890s, 1900. And they'd throw the bottles underneath the house in the back, in the kitchen. Well, over the years, as other people who had to work on the house would go in there, they found a number of them, and a few of them, thank God, survived. But that wasn't allowed, so they had to ditch the bottles underneath the house. I mean, it was just... Anyway, I don't know if I...
Yeah, no, that...
Yeah, so that's how I learned all this stuff. And you're sitting there, I mean, there's this thing, it's a brass vessel that holds water that has like a cone on the top of it. And it's like, Grandma, what the heck is that? Well, the old Chinese cooks did the laundry too. And so they put water in there, and then and that's how they put water on the thing to then iron it with and they're out there too, the irons that either heated on the stove, or they had other ones, little brass ones that you could actually shove coals into. I mean, when you're sitting in that kind of a museum, you know, and you're a little kid and you ask what's this and what's that, and I was always kind of a little bit inquisitive. Sadly, I don't remember as much as I should. But I was always...
It'll come back to you.
It gets worse, George.
Any other questions? If you got another presenter and we've already run, I've run way too long. I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you, George.